So whoever started it should also start recording. Okay.
Yeah, transcription is good. Yeah.
So welcome to the fourth session of this year's conference series of scientific and cultural dialogues. After three very scientific presentations, it was high time we moved towards the cultural area for the last two. The one from today, from the field of the humanities, and the one from tomorrow, to which you are also kindly invited, from the field of arts. Until then, let us return to our guest, whom I have the honor to introduce in the following minutes. Dr. Catalina Neculai has been an assistant professor at the Center for Academic Writing since 2009. She was also an associate research fellow in the Center for Trust, Peace, and Social Relations, and then the Center for Arts, Memory, and Communities. She has a background in English and French languages and literature with a BA, which she got from our university. And before Coventry, she studied and she also taught at Dunărea de Jos University in Galați, University of Bucharest, and from 2001 to 2009 at the University of Warwick. In 2002, she completed an interdisciplinary MA in Gender, Literature and Modernity on an Open Society Foundation scholarship. At Warwick, she was awarded a postgraduate research fellowship to research her doctorate on New York writing and the advent of neoliberal urbanism. At that time, Catalina also became recipient of the Research Travel Award from the British Association of American Studies to conduct archival research at the New York Public Library, New York University, and to network with researchers at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the City University of New York. Her doctoral thesis, which was later published as a monograph, is entitled Urban Space in Late 20th Century New York Literature, Reformed Geographies. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2014. It opened up a theoretical and methodological space for writing as urban fieldwork and the contribution of literary data to understanding urban politics, grassroots community activism, neoliberal urbanization, gentrification, real estate, and fictitious capitalism. Coming closer to this period, in 2019, she was a recipient of a grant for the gentrification, community activism, and documentary culture in New York City, a research, development, and networking project. Under this project, she was a visiting researcher at Hunter College, City University of New York, under the mentorship of Professor Kelly Anderson. Another grant, also obtained in 2019, was for the collaborative project Literacies for Life in the City of Culture, a community-based writing center in Coventry, in collaboration with Dr. Christopher Strelov from the University of Warwick. Her ongoing projects include culture documentation and community activism in New York City, which is a book project, urbanized literary consciousness and writerly communities in neoliberal New York, and community engagement and literacy for life in the City of Culture, mentioned a bit earlier. Her latest publication is entitled Brooklyn Neighborhoods in the Making for an Urbanized New York Consciousness in the Literature of Gentrification. It was included in the 2022 volume, The Palgrave Encyclopedia of Urban Literary Studies. Prior to that, she published a chapter, Neoliberal New York, Contemporary Literature and the Politics of Urban Redevelopment, in the volume New York, A Literary History, published by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Neculai's today's talk is entitled Transnational Spaces of Knowledge Production, or the Construction of Geographical Scape through Research Writing. And I'll give her the floor to give us more details. Catalina, if you please.
Thank you. Mulțumesc, Oana. Thanks so much. I mean, I'm so, first of all, it's really strange to speak in English because I know that most of you are kind of local, my people, as it were. But I'm also so happy to have Laura Mureșan from University of Economic Studies, ASE, Bucharest. So kind of facilitating networking between institutions. So happy to have Sharon, a former student of mine and collaborator, Lisa, the head of the Center for Academic Writing where I work, my boss, basically, Jill, one of my current students on our master's program. So it's really nice to see everyone here. And Miki, lovely to see you. Thank you so much, first of all, Catalina, for the generous invite. I mean, all your guests are like, I'm not sure if I kind of fit that sort of reputational capital of your guests, but I'm happy to return home with this kind of online talk. And it's interesting because it is Academic Writing Month. So at least in the Anglophone world. So in November is Academic Writing Month, where people are kind of talking about academic writing, do lots of writing every day. So this is like a challenge for everyone to engage with this. So I think it's good that the talk is happening this month, and I think that it's an interesting opportunity for me to actually, it's the first time that I'm talking publicly about these issues. I mean, I talked more or less privately with my students, as I'll tell you in a moment, and Sharon knows very well, and Laura as well, about our conversations. But it's the first time that I'm kind of bringing together publicly my writing studies and my spatial studies interest, and I hope it will make sense. But let's put my PowerPoint on, because there is a PowerPoint. Okay, so everything is okay, right? You can see everything? Yeah. Juana, can you, because you're the only one I can see on the screen. So yeah, everything is okay. Good. So I thought a lot about what I should talk about for this invited talk, and I spoke with Catalina about it, and I decided that the best thing to talk about would be research writing, because obviously that's connected with the job that I do in the Center for Academic Writing, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But also from the perspective of geography, because as you could see from Juana's generous introduction, I'm kind of working across areas of research, across fields, and I'm grateful that I have this opportunity to talk about this, because geographical thinking and thinking around space, thinking around scale, I'm not a geographer, I kind of converted to geography, but geographical thinking kind of informed a lot, if not most, of what I do with writing studies. So conceptually, methodologically, in terms of my thinking, in terms of my relations and my writing development work that I do, and I'll explain that in a second. So I think it's really good. And also I love geography, because human geography in particular, because it has a kind of sensitivity to writing. It's embedded in what geographers do. That is why I'd like to start with a couple of quotes from an article that an older article in many ways, 2003, but it's an article that I'm quite fond of, because it is about writing Europe and writing across Europe. And of course, wherever you see Europe now, you can replace it with any other kind of space, or country, continent, so on and so forth. But it's an article that is very kind of attuned to writing spaces, publishing landscapes, and there are a couple of quotes that are kind of driving my discussion today. So while much is asserted in journal about academic power knowledge systems, little detailed thought seems to have been devoted to how these, so back in 2003, how these systems are constituted and reproduced in practice. The silence we find intriguing as well as unsatisfactory. I think it needs to be said that at the same time as this article was being written, there was work in writing studies that were kind of was catching up with this and was starting to develop, moving from student writing to research writing. But I think that in 2003, that work was very, very kind of in a preliminary kind of stage. Consequently, we maintain that as academics, we need to think much harder about what we actually do, about the practices we engage in, which define what we do, about the products we both produce and consume. Writing, both the act of writing and writing as product, is a key component within this practice. In many ways, this is what my talk is about, but with a kind of sensitivity to space and how space and scale in particular becomes part of this discussion around writing. And Gregson, Simonson, and Vayu, they continue throughout their article, and they talk about collaborative patterns and how they are meeting in person and talking face to face, which is like a social relational act. And they argue that it's not just about language, but about trying to understand how each writer is situated, about the writer's own traditions, researchers' own traditions, those they share and those they do not. It is this space of listening which begins to open up difference, which I think is quite important in terms of understanding not just collaborative writing, but generally how research writing happens. As tension sometimes is disagreement, but it's ultimately about the coexistence of voices in a relationship of articulation and not of domination or incorporation. So these kind of relations of power geometries are quite important to how we view writing. The second tactic they talk about is working against the center specializing practices, and I'll explain in a moment what center means in this kind of discussion. And thinking about place and how place impinges or influences cross-cultural writing collaborations in general. So does it matter if we collaborate from Galatz and Coventry? In what way does this kind of place influence the way in which we collaborate and write? And this kind of collaboration for them within and across Europe, and here again, you can add any other place, offers the possibility of working with place itself, which I think is quite important. For example, something I haven't mentioned, but Coventry and Galatz, I'm not sure if everyone knows, but they are twin cities, which is quite interesting. And it would be interesting to kind of see how institutional histories of the university, for example, they kind of coincide and complement each other, so on and so forth. So the possibility of working with place, but also to disrupt the power geometry of center and margin. So potentially, would Coventry be a center? Would Galatz be a margin? Or the other way around? We don't know. Maybe we'll find out. So it's not just about writing, but it is about foregrounding situatedness, dialogic, open dialogue, interlocutory encounters. And this can have a destabilizing effect in terms of opening up these spaces of articulation, of meeting, of hinging, if you like. So in many ways, I love these quotes, and it was very hard for me to kind of reduce them, shrink them, because I think they articulate very well what I'm trying to say today. But I think it's a complicated topic, and I hope it will make sense. But for me to kind of enable this discussion is to use stories as a way in, if you like. And I will kind of draw upon my experience as, of course, as a migrant, and my experience with research writing in three perspectives, if you like. One is a research writing broker or developer, advisor, mentor, you can call it. I mean, obviously, these terms have got different connotations. Working with researchers from across disciplines in linguistics and academic cultures as part of my work in the Center for Academic Writing at Coventry University. Then my positionality, my identity as a researcher, working across disciplines, as you could hear from Juana's introduction, I'm everywhere, which is like both good and not so good in many ways, but there are advantages to that, and hopefully in terms of vantage point, and hopefully that will become clear, because it's not necessarily a humanities, going back to what Juana was saying, a humanities talk, it's more like humanities, social sciences kind of talk. And then obviously as an educator working with other professionals in the field of writing studies, and I'll give due credit to to my students in our master's program who kind of contributed a lot to how I'm thinking about these thoughts. So what I will then do is to offer a quick and dirty, if you like, critical bird's eye view on trends and practices in knowledge production mediated by research writing in English. And I will try and connect these perspectives with the Romanian Galatz context. And I will try and open up the discussion by putting forward some questions. So my stories, three of my stories, very quickly. The first one is connected with how I influence other people's writing. and the change that I make. And I had a lot of working with colleagues, researchers, both established and emerging researchers at Coventry, but also outside of Coventry and outside of the UK, outside of the Anglophone core, has taught me a lots of things and has kind of put me in a situation when I started to question what I'm doing in terms of its value. So I don't think that working with colleagues on their writing is value free. I think that I do something with that writing. And I'm not sure if what I do with that writing is good or bad. Like, for example, I was working with a Romanian colleague a few good years ago who was a visiting researcher in the Center for Academic Writing. And then this Romanian colleague went back home and they spoke with their doctoral supervisor. They showed the writing and they said, oh, your voice is so much stronger and your structure is so much clearer, so on and so forth. So on the surface of things, that's good. But then it made me wonder how kind of powerful was that influence and what were the risks, what were the benefits to that, but I'll come back to that. So I kind of work on writing in terms of discovering writerly voice, identity, teasing out contribution to knowledge making, which is one of the most important things, and obviously unraveling, making visible processes of writing and publishing, and also mediating community creation, like, for example, telling people about other people and kind of mediating networks. So this kind of double vision became for me a bit of a double bind. And I keep thinking about it in terms of my position as a kind of a conduit for a kind of hegemonic Anglophone culture, even though I'm Romanian, but I'm operating within this Anglophone culture. If I'm an enabler of authentically articulated voices and identities or not, if I'm doing both at the same time. And I'll talk a little bit later about this kind of writing development as work that happens on the boundaries between different spaces and different scales. Of course, I'm also a researcher, and I try to do that kind of in the margins of my other work, while at the same time centrally. And that kind of my identity as a researcher, moving across spaces, of course, cities, institutions, locales, across disciplines. I moved from literary studies. Mickey knows my story very well, to cultural geography and writing studies. And this kind of helped me develop a heightened awareness of discursive and methodological diversity and ethical awareness at the same time. I've had to unlearn, Juana and I talked a lot about this, learn and unlearn kind of my researcher identity, especially during my doctorate, where my supervisor kept saying to me, you're doing this project, so what? So it was kind of an obsessive question there, which I didn't necessarily consider when I was back home. So, having done my master's in Bucharest, and then having started a doctorate at the University of Bucharest, I didn't really have those kinds of questions, didn't really come up. So it was a bit different. The experience was quite different, and it kind of made me unlearn lots of things in terms of my own writing style as well, which is still fluffy, very kind of Romanian, but in many ways it's more controlled and more disciplined. And finally, as you could see in this talk as well, I'm very much aware of my own positionality all the time, especially like, for example, working with communities of writers from different contexts, but also communities in New York, for example. I remember having a discussion with kind of renowned urban geographer David Harvey, who was at Warwick at one point, and he asked me, how come a Romanian is working on New York at Warwick in England? So it was like kind of this was interesting in terms of raising my own consciousness. But I think that I create and I inhabit a research space that's relational, because I constantly think of the kinds of voices that I follow and cite. And I think I will talk a little bit about citations at the end, because I think it's quite an important discussion in Romania, especially at the moment. But voices, not just sources, but voices. And I think that's important to articulate the kind of difference between the source and the voice, right? I think about the kinds of networks I build and why I build them, and kind of communities I work with and how I relate to them, how I build trust. For example, when we worked on the community literacy project that Juana talked about with Chris, we were very much aware that we're going into the community and kind of trying to develop literacies with people we didn't know. So we had to kind of build trust and we're kind of aware that while I was in Coventry, Chris wasn't in Coventry, what that meant for the project, so on and so forth. And finally, my kind of experience as an educator and encounters with professional others, because all of our students are professionals in their own field, and teaching and developing curriculum, bibliographies, assessments that are attuned to space, locality, issues of difference, empowered geometry has consolidated this process of kind of decentering my own knowledge and positionality. And a lot of the thoughts that I'm putting forward today were distilled in this process of curriculum creation and co-creation with my students and discussion with them. So I'm terribly thankful to my students and to this opportunity. As part of our program in academic writing development and research, I developed 2 modules. Laura was a guest speaker on my modules, and another colleague from Russia, Natalia Smirnova, who are prominent people in research writing studies. They know about these modules. So one is contextual issues in developing research communication, and another one is academic writing, multilingualism, and knowledge production. So how we navigate all these issues across spaces. And finally, it's important that engaging with practitioners in writing studies and teaching writing was interesting to me, because almost all the students who are coming to these modules were not necessarily aware of research writing. Research writing was new to them. So opening up a space for discussion meant testing the accessibility of these discourses, of these ideas, meant probing questions from my students as well, and that helped a lot. So I just want to give you some examples, because it's important to, as I was saying, to give credit to my students. Some examples around assessment designs, like I have 2 kinds of assessment on these modules. One is an institutional case study that tries to link national, local, and individual research policies and practices. And I've had lots of interesting discussions, case studies from across the world, institutions in Qatar, Germany, Canada, Italy, England, and Wales, which is quite an important distinction, not Britain, Nigeria, Czech Republic, so on and so forth. And there is another assignment, which is like a critical review of issues of equity in research writing and knowledge production in non-Anglophone countries. So it's specifically designed to open up the discussion outside of the UK, like the occupied Palestine territories, China, Russia, Mexico, Germany. So very, very interesting insights from my students. So I learned a lot from them as well. And then I have supervised, interestingly, 3 projects on these issues. And again, I think it's important that I mention them, because there was a lot of work that my students put into them. One was also by my colleague Carissa Brain on one-to-one writing development for academics, activities of support and developer beliefs. Carissa interviewed writing developers like myself in the UK and the US, and she distilled some ideas around support and developer beliefs. I think she's working on publishing some of this, hopefully she will. A very interesting project by Ian Daniels in 2020 during the pandemic. Both of them were during the pandemic, navigating trajectories to equitable centers. Ian worked with postdoctoral Spanish researchers, and he interviewed them, and he looked at the ways in which they were kind of using writing as a way to accessing kind of different career options, so on and so forth. So very, very interesting project as well. And finally, because Sharon is here, Sharon Saad's work with life histories of Palestinian scholars this year was just like mind-blowingly amazing. She used Bourdieu and kind of scientific authority and scientific fields, the notion of capital, to understand how researchers in the occupied Palestinian territories were navigating research and writing practices in the so-called peripheral conditions, obviously. Sharon is working on a publication for this. So amazing work that's being done. And I think it's important to consider this work alongside, obviously, the research that's being published in the field. So what I have learned from all of these is that, and I probably start with the last but one point, that writing is not just about how we put words on paper and how, whether we write correctly or not. Definitely not research writing, not even student writing, but I'm not talking about student writing today. That writing is ideological, that it's not kind of universal, if you like, not even writing in English. So even if we were to use the same kind of linguistic common denominator, and this is very important. It's coming from the work of Brian Street. I should have put that there as a reference. That writing is ideological, is not kind of autonomous, if you like. That is context and space bound. That it's plural and diverse. And in research writing, as I'll talk in a moment, it's influenced by local policies, and maybe you can think about the kinds of policies that, for example, Dunărea de Jos has, the university in Galați has, in terms of regulating research writing, different strategies, different material conditions. The writing gets produced in this kind of matrix of networks, and brokers like myself, like sponsors of writing, which may be construed as both enabling but also thwarting, kind of diminishing voice. Like, for example, peer review reports. How much does peer reviewing change the way in which we are as writer and the way in which we write and think? And finally, I think research writing is kind of caught, and this is a very kind of Marxist way of looking at things, as maybe you've realized by now that my approach is fairly left-wing in this case, that research writing is caught between use and exchange value, right? So we have the use value of writing in terms of intellectual pursuit. It's great to sit around and read and write whatever we want, versus research writing as currency of exchange for career progression, for example, performance evaluations, professional esteem, institutional prestige, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of bound up with these kinds of forms of capital accumulation, whether it's material or symbolic capital. For example, in the UK, universities get money from the government based on the quality of the research as a result of research evaluation frameworks. And there is an amount of money that's given per article published. So there are various such kind of modes of financial accumulation as well. But of course, like power to linguistic, social, symbolic, so on and so forth. Why does space matter in this kind of scenario? What is its usefulness? And then more importantly, beyond kind of physical, social space, I'll explain that in a moment, what are the kind of codes that we use for space, for locality, for where we are? And how do these codes help us understand our own positions in producing and circulating knowledge, both within our borders and outside our borders? And then a very important question, more like food for thought, at which point do we want to reinforce the space which we inhabit of knowledge production? And at which point do we subvert it and transcend it? And how do we do that? So just a couple of very quick points around space and a kind of understanding of space. I hope there are no geographers in the room because they will find this very reductive. But scale is very important within spatial studies because it articulates spatial differences and differentiations. It's produced and is produces and is produced by geographical structures of social interaction. So there is this notion in geography that space is socially produced, that space is not just a container. And scale as a way of kind of understanding spatial difference is in the same way, is kind of politically constructed, but it's both a site for control and contestation as well. So we can jump scale, for example, like from the local to the global. And I'll show you a graphic in a moment. Like, for example, issues around globalization and localization. So jumping scale on a vertical kind of hierarchy from the bottom to the top and vice versa. But also scale in geography is seen in conjunction with other spatial configurations like territory, national territory, for instance, frontiers, borders. For instance, just to give you an example, in Sharon's project on Palestinians' life histories, the question of border and territory became crucial to understanding research practices and research writing, right? So how we cross those and how we resist those kinds of spatializations of life ultimately becomes important. Then we have the question of place as well, which is about situated spaces like core periphery, semi-periphery, symbolic practices within particular locales, and finally networks. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. But graphically, in terms of scale, we have this kind of nested hierarchy from the body. For example, an embodied voice in a research article that becomes very important, right? The kind of positionality to the global. How do we respond to, for instance, global competition, world rankings? I saw that in Romania there is a big debate around world rankings and where Romania is within that, Romanian institutions. So that kind of transcendence, where does it happen and how does it happen? But I think those nested scales and seeing scale as hierarchy is quite important, because then you need to think as you write, for instance, as you do research, how do I transcend my home, my community, my city kind of scale, positioning, if you like. The community is probably one of the most porous sort of scales, because it cuts across, we have global communities as well, right? So it cuts across other types of scale. But I thought I should kind of put this on the same slide with those of us doing language studies. We are aware of this kind of Fairclough's 3 dimensions of discourse, where a text needs to speak up to other discourse practices and other sociocultural practices. So a text on the page, it's not just a neutral, value-free kind of text. It has connections outside of its limits. It has connections, for example, doctoral writing needs to be connected with institutional practices, institutional criteria of assessment. It needs to be connected with writing within disciplinary communities or interdisciplinary communities, right? So I think that seeing these graphics as nested scales and hierarchies is quite important. But what does the global look like? And I'm using these graphics which come from research. The one on the right, the bubbles, the inflated global north of knowledge production, is a project from the London School of Economics. It looks at data from a research output between 1990 and 2011, and it shows the big bubbles are the global north, right, and the Western world, whereas the small maps are the global south. But if we look at the other one on the left, we see the famous ISI database. Again, data coming from 2011, so it's quite interesting to see it in a mirroring sort of exercise. Comes from the University of Oxford. There was a project there, and if you look at the top 5 articles, ISI articles per million capita, again, the US and Western Europe is the reddest, right, on that map. So I think that understanding these kinds of power geometries in terms of how research writing is produced and circulated is very important as well. There is also an interesting debate of what counts as research writing, because, for example, there is a discussion around local knowledges that becomes invisible research, like local reports, so on and so forth. So that's significant. Like, for instance, Coventry University, in order to go through the research evaluation framework that we have in the UK, they told us research articles are more important than book chapters, right? So I think there are certain consequences of this kind of mapping in terms of our own practices and what we choose to write, or whether we don't choose to write because other people choose for us. Going back to my students, this is like a funny representation of power geometries through Lego play, which I did with my students before the pandemic in 2019. And it was my first attempt at using Lego Play, and then the pandemic came and we never met in person. But after that, but I kept these visualizations because I think the one on the right represents China, and the kind of China is a rising global power of knowledge production, and the kind of infrastructures, and so different kinds of visualizations. I thought it would be like a different way of kind of seeing power geometries, and I have their permission to circulate these photos in the Center for Academic Writing. That's they taken there. So what are the common kind of spatial framings for research writing? So we think of research writing in terms of core, Anglophone, Anglo-American, Western, Global North versus periphery, non-Anglophone, Eastern, Global South. But there's also this notion of semi-periphery, and maybe we can think about Romania as being on the semi-periphery. I don't know, we can talk about that later, as a kind of an in-between space between core and periphery. An outdated model is developed and developing world, even more outdated, first world and third world. We no longer talk in those terms. We also consider kind of a geographical distribution in keeping with language, with the inner circle where we have British Australia, North America, outer circle, British colonies with English as a second language, and expanding circle with English as a foreign language. Romania is definitely a kind of outside of these. Local, institutional, supranational, regional, global kind of framings, like for example, Brazil, Russia, India, and China as BRIC countries, or PIGS country, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain as kind of Southern European. Those constitute conglomerates, if you like, national conglomerates, and there can be collaborations, but also influence and competition between them, right? For example, the British Academy has got a writing workshop, writing for publication workshop for the Global South, and I've always wondered how much is kind of British colonialism and how much is actually developing Global South knowledge. And there is there are discussions around this, and how fraught the notion of the Global South catching up with the Global North is, because there's no such thing. For example, a researcher in Belgium in urban studies was recently arguing that 3 out of 4 urban studies journal articles are written in the Global North. So that's quite a chilling kind of statistic, right? Of course, we have all these other distinctions that are non-discursive, primarily, so material, around material inequities. There is a lot of discussion these days, I saw in my bubble on social media, around how much money there is from the gross domestic product is given to research or to education in Romania, and how that affects world ranking positioning. But of course, access to academic resources, financial resources, and other infrastructures, research labor conditions. In the UK, that's an important point in terms of fixed term contracts, research time allocation, rights to do research, so on and so forth, separating teaching and research, etc. And then obviously access to academic networks and mobility routes. How much freedom of movement do we have? Of course, there are different proxies for space and scale, like, for example, research methodologies and knowledge construction, how we view knowledge. I recently saw a tweet by someone who was arguing that their paper was rejected because it was qualitative study and it couldn't be generalized. So there is, in this kind of Anglophone sort of publishing world, there is an obsession with positivism still, which is quite strange, especially during a time when we try to kind of bring local knowledges into play, like indigenous knowledge making, for example. There are all these tensions between localism or parochialism, and Laura's research talks about that in terms of researchers in the University of Economic Studies in Bucharest, how they think of research, their research methods, the scope of their research as being parochial, how they're told this through peer review reports. But there's also this other side of research, of exoticizing and transnationalizing knowledge through extractive practices. Like, for example, Anglophone researchers going to South Africa to do research and then extracting knowledge and then publishing it and so on and so forth. So the kind of power relations there are quite interesting. And then the notion of kind of killing epistemologies or creating a monoculture, epistemic monoculture that Karen Bennett talks about in terms of translation, for example, or peer review, how peer reviewing changes the way in which we write, and kind of killing of existing knowledge patterns. And finally, there are other proxies for space, like the use of language, whether we use English or local languages, linguistic attrition. That was particularly interesting. I went to a conference, and Laura was there as well, in Iceland, and they were talking about how Icelandic was kind of becoming, was not being used for research, and that was leading to linguistic attrition. Then various discursive and rhetorical conventions of writing in English, like how we structure writing, how we project identity in writing, contribution to knowledge, authority, how they become codes for international and high quality core research. And then the extent to which genre conventions are coded or occluded, hidden, and how much we need to explain them. And there is a lot of research in there as well. So I think it's important to kind of consider, even within our institutional context, the taken for grantedness. How much do we take for granted the fact that colleagues know how to do these things, right? Especially within this kind of very heavy evaluation regime, the so-called publish or perish culture. Because obviously we exist within this kind of system of evaluation. There are different national evaluation systems. The case studies, for example, that my students prepared showed me the extent of that kind of difference. Discussions I've had with WANA, for example, around the point system for promotion and things like that in Romania. In the UK, it's not as much around that, as it is about institutional recognition through this kind of research excellence framework. Then there is also not just bibliometrics, but also altmetrics, the use of social media, blogging, and things like that for publicizing research, impact factors, so on and so forth. What are the consequences of these on our writing practices? There are at least 2 articles which I'm really keen on. One is by Sharon McClough in 2017, looking at their impact, the impact of the Research Excellence Framework for researchers in England. And very recently, a very important piece of research by Horta and Lee, which my colleague in Sweden, Kristin Solli, she drew our attention to it, doctoral students in mainland China, Hong Kong, and Macau, the pressures on publishing for doctoral students and what it means and how it changes identity, researcher identity. So how do we actually go from one, how do we transcend all these spaces? How do we do scale jumping? How do we resist kind of the spaces we inhabit? We do that through scholarly work, which is like a kind of a boundary object, because obviously scholarly work travels across boundaries, is regulated by certain conventions, but also negotiated to a certain extent. We do research, we do this through networked activity. I forgot to put the year for Lillis and Curry, 2010. Via network routes and nodes and network ties. There is also this interesting kind of understanding of institutional context, of networks making up for the lack of, for solid institutional infrastructures, the absence of those. In Medina has an interesting book on centers and periphery knowledge production, which I very much recommend. The question here is like, how flat or hierarchical is this network research ontology? It looks like it's flat, right? We collaborate, we create networks that support us, but there are these gatekeeping practices by editors, reviewers, but also us writing developers, which become ultimately gatekeeping spatial and scalar boundaries. This is what we're doing. We're kind of preserving the high quality features of the global north in terms of knowledge production, the universalism of the science, the rigor of the science, so on and so forth. For example, there is an interesting discussion in a book that's very close to my heart, The Geopolitics of Academic Writing, by a Sri Lankan researcher, Suresh Kanagaraja, who talks about the use of narrative and how in 2002, late 90s, the use of narrative as research method was very much frowned upon, whereas now it's much more accepted, right? So there are those kinds of changes that are happening, luckily. when do we disrupt this kind of scale, and how do we do it? By, for example, making local knowledge count, but also being aware of jumping scale and kind of making it count for others who are not locally situated as well. And then obviously writing in local languages, doing both. There is a lot of discussion these days around writing both in local languages and in English. And then obviously this kind of event, for example, is an opportunity to do this kind of scale jumping and cutting across scales and talking about these things. Now, finally, where is Romania on the map? And I hope we get at least a few 10 minutes for discussion. And I'm happy to discuss either in English or in Romanian, as you prefer. So I'm not sure where Romania is on the map. I won't show you a map because I think it's still there in many ways. But I would say that Romania is probably like kind of in between core and periphery places. It has characteristics of both in some sense. There is access, but at the same time, there isn't access, if you like. And it's more of a networked, using Medina's term, instead of institutionalized academic world, because it relies a lot on kind of informal networks and things like this, where the institutionalization is slowly happening. There is a lot of groundbreaking research already coming out of that has come out of Romania, and I've mentioned Laura's research, but also in collaboration with Mirela Bardi at the University of Economic Studies, and Catalina Neculai, who's emeritus professor there, I think now. They have written amazing work on understanding Romanian academics' attitudes towards the uses of English. And different perceptions of advantage, disadvantage, even before a very famous article by Ken Hyland happened, like the question of linguistic disadvantage in 2016. So Laura and Carmen Perez Lantada in Spain, they were already exploring those issues. Then looking at writing practices of off-network researchers as they perceive them, and different challenges like linguistic, rhetorical, methodological, institutional, which I'm sure that happen in Galați as well. And then very interesting insights into, for example, I found publishing landscape at the University of Economic Studies. There were 16 journals at the university in 2015. I thought that was an amazing kind of statistic. As you could see, I don't use much statistics because I'm more of a qualitative researcher. But what would be the questions that we can ask for Romania and from Galați? These are my questions, but I don't know if you think they're important. How do these issues in kind of spatial positioning and the consequences of space, sorry, I need to move the Teams icon, how do they address Romanian knowledge-making context? How relevant are they? How important are they? I mean, of course, they're important because obviously Laura and colleagues wouldn't have done research on them, but how can they actually change locally what we do? How does a university like the Lower Danube, which is not just like Coventry University, where I am, not a traditionally research university, how does a university engage with these processes, from evaluation regimes to supporting research writing? Yeah. I mean, I keep thinking about my intention a few years ago to set up a writing center for researchers only, for academics at the University of Galați. And there was lots of discussion around, oh, but professors would not come to be supported. And why not? What's the, you know, so the importance of networking, like how do we actually navigate that? How do research governance structures and policies at various scales affect researchers' writing and publishing practices? For example, the point system in Romania, what does that make one do in terms of getting published? What is the local, regional, or national publishing landscape? And finally, not finally, last but one, what kinds of boundary work take place in Romania, for example, in terms of establishing university presses, funding routes, network development, addressing disciplinary equity. I remember when I was in Galați in the 90s, at the beginning of 2000s, there was a lot of privileging of engineering, for instance. So the humanities were quite marginalized at the time. I'm not sure what the situation is now, but that was the situation then. So finally, and this is a kind of a teaser, what issues in Romanian academia are worthy of critical inquiry? And I put this here, the question of plagiarism, because I told Laura that I would try and speak a little bit about this, knowing that it's such a political kind of discussion around it. But how can we depoliticize it, not de-ideologize it, because it is an ideological question, but how can we move from this kind of witch hunting that is happening currently to understanding citation practices of Romanian academics, to understanding research policies that prompt this, to moving away from a discipline and punish kind of mechanism of quantitative software detection. I saw recent debates and I'm a bit at a loss because I don't quite understand why all the debates are around scores, Turnitin scores or other software plagiarism detection that you have. How can we turn this discussion around maximizing writerly voice, grasping disciplinary and cultural differences, so on and so forth? It seems to me that there is a lot of taken for grantedness of people knowing how to reference. So yeah, so this is it. I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catalina. And now I would like to invite the audience to address Catalina's questions and also to address questions to Catalina. Am înțeles că ai vrea să purtăm discuția în română?
I'm okay either way. Yeah, Romanian, English. I know there are some people who can't speak Romanian, so I don't know. It's entirely English would be better, probably. Yeah, okay.
If I may, well, I'll start by thanking Catalina for her thought-provoking speech. I must say from the offset that she's a former student of ours and the current critical friend, as she puts it. I love the phrase, so I'm going to use it and abuse it, Catalina, just be warned. So I appreciated the way in which you managed to marry, let's say, two fields of interest that you've two fields that you've specialized in along the years. And my question would be, and I'm not sure whether I'm actually expecting an answer, but it's something that has been bothering me for years. And it has to do with another marriage. How could one marry, let's say, the knowledge-making mechanism, knowledge construction, and knowledge imposition in the end, with the notion of unlearning, what has been somehow powerfully, intrusively, ingrained in our mind and in our system. Let's put it that way.
I think that, first of all, I was forced to unlearn. Because otherwise I wouldn't have passed my PhD if I had to unlearn. So let's put it this way, right? So because I was working within a different kind of institutional framing, different expectations. But also, I think I had the privilege of working with someone, my PhD supervisor, who knew writing. He was very familiar with kind of writing by virtue of being American. And I'm sorry, this is like ethnic essentialism, but there is in the US, and Lisa obviously can tell us about it even more or testify to this. In the US, writing is part of university education from year one. So there is a kind of awareness raising constantly around writing. So I had the privilege of learning a lot about my own writing from my supervisor. Like, for example, and you'd appreciate this, Mickey, you know, because I was very much into post-structuralism at the time, like Derrida and all that stuff. So then I moved towards all this other stuff, which is more material. But I had the tendency a lot to talk about myself, like, and talk about the writing I was doing, like in a meta way, like, and now I will discuss this. And there was a lot of signposting. And my supervisor, Stephen Shapiro, his name is, he told me, just let the ideas go. Don't talk a lot about the kitchen all the time. You know, we don't need to know that all the time. So, or he would map out my argument or things like that. So it was, I think that's unlearning process was important. But also I think this transdisciplinarity, being exposed to academic writing research, which was different from, by virtue of my job, which was different from literary studies or cultural studies, and then being exposed to like kind of even more, I had that exposure through geography already, you know, like understanding social sciences, for example. And then being exposed to writing across all disciplines, working with engineering writing. Catalina would be happy to know that I kind of, I don't feel like I have a lot to say, but I worked with engineering writing as well and things like that. So I think there is it forces me, my experience forced me to sort of do that kind of unlearning. But I also think that through critical friendship and peer discussion, being open to share your writing, for example, like how many of us do we give writing to other colleagues, and how confident are we to do that? How much trust is there? Like I spoke with, during one of our retreats, I spoke with colleagues in business studies in my university, and they were saying, oh, but I'm afraid my ideas will be stolen, which was mind-blowing to me. I thought like, oh my goodness, I would never think like that, you know? So, but I think that creating a kind of a trust and sharing writing is crucial. Like I don't see any other way. And you become less defensive and you open up more.
Yeah, you're very right. I believe that mostly happens in the humanities. I know that the engineering field is much more prone, let's say, to collaboration and
Exactly.
networking and producing group work of some sort, which we tend to avoid, unfortunately, I would say. But yes, you're very right. It's just, you know, inspiring to see how you manage to eventually exploit this area of critical discourse analysis in the end, with the shift from the text as space, a space in its own right, to discourse with the associated politics, and eventually to social practice, which blends sociology and geography and the rest.
Exactly.
But so thank you for your speech, and it was a pleasure on our part. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Preisler, for your comments.
Laura.
Professor Mureșan, if you please.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, I hear you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this very complex presentation and bringing in so many perspectives on actually academic writing, academic cultures, and just thinking, of course, of you've opened up so many Pandora's boxes that it's even difficult to sort of take just one, but maybe it is important to give credit also to disciplinary practice. So of course we have local practices. We have different academic cultures now more and more shifting in the direction of the Anglophone Center. But then there are also disciplinary practices, and also the idea of parochialism is probably more prominent in the social sciences and in certain disciplines. In STEM, for instance, you don't have so much parochialism present. So therefore, for some academics, it's more difficult to find to make their voice heard, because the topics that they are researching are probably not of international interest. So there are a lot of aspects, as you were saying, in the sense it's not just about how you write, but also what you choose to research and write about, becoming aware of what is publishable, what is not, and of course, um, I liked a lot sort of your idea of scales and nesting scales and jumping scales, and finding a way of in the end having enough trust to share what one is thinking and writing about in different stages, in different drafting stages. And it is true that in Romanian culture this does not happen a lot. And of course, it has its, yeah, it comes with a cost, let's put it this way. It comes with a cost. Yeah.
No,
Thank you
I'm
very
really
much.
glad it makes sense.
Guys, with a lot of food for thought.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to think a lot of the Romanian context as well, but I don't have, I think I learned more from your work, Laura, and yours and Mariana's and Mirella's than I know in real life, as it were, because I mean I get glimpses, my discussions with Mickey and Juana, for example, my discussions with colleagues, informal discussions, but I don't really have like a clear sense of where the work is going in Romania. I mean, I know that I'm close to becoming annoyed by the plagiarism debate, because I feel that I think it needs to kind of transcend the kind of sort of sensationalist perspective and become a real discussion. Maybe it happens and I don't see it, but I think that it needs to become a real discussion locally, like why do we use sources, how do we use them, how do we regulate this beyond the software stuff, so but anyway, that's just me with
I think this is also a very complex discussion, because the soft is not perfect, and even when citing properly, it still does not do a proper job. That's one thing. The other thing is people in the legal profession, academics, our colleagues, academics in the legal profession, they explain that, again, there are so many disciplinary differences, and one has to understand, because you don't find something one measure fits all. So again, it has to be more nuanced, and at the same time, of course, developing or bringing more awareness to citation, to not being afraid of bringing other voices into the text, but knowing how to do it. And I think that's why I think that the whole discussion is very, very complex.
So I would, in relation to that, I would propose that your next speech, Catalina, might be on plagiarism and the re-outlining of geographies of the mind, because I think I understand that this is where you're going. It's not a question of plagiarism serving or supporting that culture of disciplining and punishing, but changing mentalities,
Exactly.
looking at the way in which our minds work in connection with the threat, but also the fear of committing the crime of plagiarism.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, for example, with my students, I don't use the word at all. I don't talk about plagiarism. They are obsessed because they keep asking me, what about plagiarism? What about the software? Just like, leave the software. I don't want to talk about the software, you know. But it's not, academic integrity is not my area of research necessarily, but because I do it as part of my teaching, I realize that it's important to talk about it, but also to talk about it in terms of voices. I think that's, yeah. I realize it's 5 past. Sorry, we kind of exceeded the time. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so if there are any other questions or comments? If not, I think we can thank again Catalina for her very thought-provoking discussion today, and also to thank Professor Catalin Fetecău for organizing these sessions. I renew my invitation to join tomorrow the discussion on visual arts at 6 p.m. And with that, I'll give Professor Catalin Fetecău the floor to do the closing part.
Mulțumesc foarte mult. O să închei în limba română așa cum am început, pentru a nu face greșeli în fața unor profesioniști ai limbii engleze și nu mai, și mulțumesc tuturor. Și vă aștept mâine, așa cum a spus și Oana, pentru ultima întâlnire de anul acesta la Dialoguri cu Sorin Purcaru. Mulțumesc foarte mult Cătălinei. Sper să ne revedem și la anul și sugestiile făcute de Michi și să ne întâlnim împreună sănătoși. Mulțumesc tuturor participanților din universitatea noastră și din afara universității și celor de față și viitor. Închei cu salutul regal, sănătate. Mulțumiri!
Mulțumesc și eu pentru participare.
Cele bune! Mulțumim! Mulțumim!
Bye!
Mulțumesc foarte mult, Oana! Mulțumesc, Cristi! Mulțumesc, Oana! Mersi mult! Mersi!